Hello, my name is Przemysław Strożek. I am a Fulbrighter and a curator of the exhibition on post-war American art from Archiv der Avantgarden. At the beginning, I would like to express my gratitude to Fulbright Commission and Sopot State Art Gallery for organizing this event, and I am very happy to promote it via live streaming, and it's also one of the first experience for me to do that, and I am very happy to guide you through this exhibition. I think this exhibition is very important for Poland, especially because there are not so many possibilities to see post-war American art in our country, and I was very happy to collaborate with Sopot State Art Gallery and Archiv der Avantgarden on this very exhibition. The title is From Black Mountain College to Pop Art, Post-War American Art and Documents from the Archiv der Avantgarden, and the title suggests and indicates two important things. First of all, we deal with artistic phenomena, artistic art schools and avant-garde developments and transformations in the United States. And second of all, we deal with documents and artworks which are coming from one particular collection. Before starting this tour, I will only tell few minutes about this institution, Archiv der Avantgarden. Archiv der Avantgarden, the Archive of the Avant-Gardes, is placed in Dresden, and it is a collection donated by German-Italian collector Gideon Martin. It contains more than 1 million objects, so it's a really big and huge archive, and it's a part of Dresden State Art Collections. And this is also very important to know that the selection of those artworks here on post-war American art, it's a very small fragment of the whole collection. So maybe 0.0001% of what is in the whole collection. So my task as a curator was to select and find artworks suitable to the exhibition and to tell a kind of a story about post-war American art based on avant-garde developments on the other side of the Atlantic. So I was very happy to collaborate on that project, and I decided to structure this exhibition around specific artistic phenomena: Black Mountain College, Fluxus, pop art, minimal art, land art and conceptual art, to in a chronological way tell the story about the developments and transformations of post-war American avant-garde. I started with Black Mountain College because it was a school which was founded in 1933, but in the 1940s started to be a very important place for the experimental arts. Among professors and teachers at the school was, for example, Robert Moderwell, whose piece we are exhibiting here, which is in line with abstract expressionism, very important artistic phenomena from the United States. And I found it's a very striking piece, like to be in the front and the starting point of the exhibition. When we will go a little bit to this side, I organized this section around Black Mountain College, and also even if we are using the term post-war American art, there are also some artists who were actually not born in the United States, because a lot of them were immigrants, like for example Willem De Konig, who came to Black Mountain College in 1948, or Józef Albers or Shanti Shawiński. A lot of artists came from Europe to teach at this experimental school, which was based at the Lake Eden in North Carolina. The profile of the school is sometimes described as a new Bauhaus, because, like for example, Józef Albers and Shanti Shawiński came there from Bauhaus, fleeing Nazi Germany in 1933. They came to North Carolina and were appointed at this school to teach there. experimental arts, and also it was a school much more devoted to American progressivism in education on the one hand, and how artist and natural environment can interact with each other. So even if it is called a new Bauhaus, a kind of different approach toward artistic experience was placed in that very school in North Carolina. Among the important designers and one of the few architects who taught courses at the Black Mountain College was Buckminster Fuller, whose geodesic domes we are exhibiting here. And he came to Black Mountain College in 1948, and those structures were really based on the natural environment, because when we think about Black Mountain College, it is a place located in the mountains on the lake, at the Lake Eden in North Carolina, which was a very interesting place for artistic experimentation. So among the teachers and professors at the school was also Willem De Konig, who was actually a Dutch artist and who came in 1926 to United States, but is regarded as one of the most important representatives of abstract expressionism, the very important American artistic trend of the 1940s. And his early works we have also in the collection of Archiv der Avantgarden, which are on the border of figuration and abstraction. This what I also wanted to say at the beginning about the immigrants coming to Black Mountain College is the fact that immigrants shaped, in fact, American art, and it was also a very important place and meeting spot for them. In 1948, by the year when Willem De Konig came to the Black Mountain College and Buckminster Fuller, it was a groundbreaking year for the artistic practice at the school, because also to the school arrived John Cage, a very important avant-garde musician, Maris Cunningham, who is here on the left, a dancer who was dancing to the musical scores by John Cage. Here is Willem De Konig, whose drawings we already saw at the beginning, his early drawing in the style of abstract expressionism, and Joseph Albers, who is on the left and who came to Black Mountain from Bauhaus. Those photographs which we see here, and here is also a view on the Lake Eden, so the place where actually Black Mountain College was placed. When we look at those photographs, we see that they are a little bit different in cropping. When we, for example, look at those portraits, for example, this one of Willem De Konig, maybe we can show here, we see that like the photograph of this artist is not fully present. And this is an important fact because the photographer was Hazel Larsen Archer. She was a professor of photography at the school, and she was on the wheelchair, so she could only show her point of view like being on the wheelchair. That's why this cropping of those photographs is always shows her subjective viewing, like her point of view from the wheelchair. That's why sometimes, like we see that, for example, here the chin is cut, or like the not fully face is present. This is also important in this context when we think about photography, because photography is always presented as a kind of objective art. But here, and what Hazel Larsen Archer, the teacher of photography, was saying that photography is always subjective point of view. And when you are like on the wheelchair, you have always a different point of view to see the world and to capture the world, or to crop the photographs, like for example in this documentation of the 1948 year at the school. of Black Mountain College. Among the students who came at the same year of 1948 and also was taking classes of Hazel Larsen Archer was Robert Rauschenberg, who also was at the first moment interested in photography. This very interesting photograph made by Hazel Larsen Archer shows actually Robert Rauschenberg dancing with Elizabeth Janerian, and I found this photograph very intriguing because it shows how a person who is on the wheelchair, who cannot move, is capturing the movement, and I found it like very striking and very powerful how she captures the very essence of the movement. In the Archive of the Avantgarde, like all the artworks are coming from our archive, we have also one student work by Robert Rauschenberg, which comes actually from the estate of Hazel Archer, of the photograph teacher. And actually, Robert Rauschenberg was the personality and person, a very important artist who invited, or not maybe invited, but told C. Twombly to arrive at the school. And C. Twombly came to the school at the beginning of the 1950s, and he developed his abstract vocabulary, taking classes under the Robert Moderwell. If you remember the first image and first painting which we presented, it was his teacher, Robert Moderwell, taught C. Twombly at Black Mountain College, and here we have a kind of framework to frame all those artists together. C. Twombly was regarded at the Black Mountain College as one of the most poetic and lyrical artists and students who were taught there, and also in the archive we have the Song of the Border Guards by Robert Duncan, a poet from the Black Mountain College, designed actually by C. Twombly. It was his very first design he did ever in his artistic career. Now C. Twombly is regarded as one of the most important abstract painters in the United States. As I talked at the beginning, Archive of the Avantgarde contains not only artwork but also a lot of documents. And for example, in the archive there is also the Black Mountain Review, a review published by the poets of Black Mountain. As we think about this school located at Lake Eden in North Carolina, which was from 1933 till 1957, we can kind of experience every kind of artistic activity, not only abstract expressionism and painting, design and architecture like Buckminster Fuller, photography like Hazel Archer, or drawing by C. Twombly. There were also poets and also avant-garde musicians and dancers like John Cage and Merce Cunningham. The school has been closed in 1957, but some of the artists already left at the beginning of the 1950s the school, like Robert Moderwell and also Joseph Albers, whose photograph we already shown. And Joseph Albers came at the beginning of the 1950s to New Haven to teach there and started to explore the issues around the homage to a square. It was a kind of very important work for him. He did it for 20 years, only changing the colors of the four shapes of the squares, and the whole series is called Homage to a Square. He developed it like almost 20 years long after he left Black Mountain College and came to Yale. So when we think about the Black Mountain College and its importance and what kind of artists were there, like Joseph Albers and others, For example, Joseph Albers was also very important for developments of color-filled painting, which is also here represented by Frank Stella, and on the other hand, by Walter Darby Bannard, but maybe we will show it later, and Ad Reinhardt, whose works we also have here in our collection. So after 1957, when Black Mountain College was closed, as I told, like some of the professors already left the school, and other was John Cage, who started to be a very important figure for the new generation in New York. Coming from Black Mountain, from a place with natural environment, he came to the metropolis and started to teach a course at the New School of Social Research. Among the artists who attended his classes were, for example, Alan Kaprow and Dick Higgins and Al Hansen. Those artists in New York heard about the stories of Black Mountain College, and actually in 1952 it was an important performance piece presented in that very school and guided by John Cage, Robin Rauschenberg and Merce Cunningham. It was called Theater Piece, and it is viewed by the professors and by the scholarship as a prototype of happening. So also John Cage started to talk about his experiences at the Black Mountain College to the New York audience, and among them was Alan Kaprow, who actually is regarded as one of the personalities who coined the term happening. And happening, which is a form of arts where performance and spectators, there is no kind of division between spectators and performers. It has been started to be very popular in the New York scene, and Alan Kaprow, who is here, is the one who coined the term at the end of the 1950s with his article Legacy of Jackson Pollock, and later on in this happening presented at Royben Gallery in 1959 in New York, which is called 18 Happenings in 6 Parts. This is regarded as actually the first happening. So we are now in New York in 1959, and the scene started to be very influenced especially by John Cage, and in 1961 a new group started to be formed. The new group was called Fluxus, and it was guided by Dick Higgins and also Alison Knowles, his wife, whose portrait we can also see over there. It's actually a very important artist who started to paint like in informal style, as we see here, by the end of the 1950s, but later on started to be a very important member of the Fluxus group. And she was also one of the initiators of the performance called Make a Salad, which was a kind of performance where there was no division between spectators and performance, and everyone was making a salad. So those scores we are also having like the original scores by Alison Knowles to present here in this exhibition. As I told, John Cage was a very important figure for the Fluxus group, which was founded in 1961 in New York. And John Cage's performances and music scores were performed, for example, by Dick Higgins here with Alison Knowles, Nam June Paik. Here is a piece by John Cage called Not Wanting to Say Anything About Marcel, which is a kind of homage to a very important artist, Marcel Duchamp, who was one of the founding figures of the also American avant-garde, because he was a founder of the New York Dada after he came to New York from Paris in 1920s. So in this section, I wanted to show some documentation of the happenings and performances by Fluxus artists, and also show, because this is also important in a question how to present happening, because when we think about happening, it's a form of art which is always at the one place, at a certain place and a certain time. Happening cannot happen all the time. That's why when we think about the archive and the documentation of that, in the Archiv of Avantgarde we have very important posters by Alan Kaprow, and which somehow explained how the happening will be conducted by the artists and by the performance and by the spectators. We have like 4 examples of happenings by Alan Kaprow from the 1960s. Fluids, transfer, moving, runner. Even artists connected to pop art like Claes Oldenburg was also involved in the happening culture in the New York scene. Among artists who I decided to select for this exhibition to show those developments visually and based on documentation and artworks from Black Mountain College to Fluxus now is a very important artist, Ray Johnson. He's a little bit now unknown. But he was a student at Black Mountain College. He also took courses of photography with Hazel Archer. But when he came to New York, he started to be a Fluxus member and came to the group together with Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles. Those collages presented here are, in my opinion, very important and very interesting in the context of our times. When we, for example, will show here one of the postcards, he was a grounding member of the New York Correspondence School and kind of a pioneering figure of mail art. And he was creating like cutting out fragments from newspapers and putting also some notes. I think it's a kind of prefiguration of today's Twitter or today's Facebook, where a lot of like news and images are connecting with each other together with some descriptions. And in the archive of the avant-garde, we have more than 160 of those, but of course, due to the limitation of this space, we couldn't show more. For Fluxus artists, important was like that there is no division, not only no division like in happening between spectators and performance, but there is also no division between art and life. The art and life, they are together in a constant flux, and this is the most important thing when we think about kind of showing that art, it's not only art to be exhibited in museums, but also art which is artistic practice in a constant flux. One of the artists connected to Fluxus was also George Brecht and Robert Watts. He is a telephone by George Brecht. The important thing for Fluxus artists was that they very often used the boxes which were a sort of a mini museums, and this is also a reference to Marcel Duchamp. I already talked about him with regard to the piece by John Cage, that he was also a personality who created a museum in a box and who tried to show everything in the boxes. This was also very important for the Fluxus artists. This series of 23 photographs of cars is presented by Robert Watts. who was who now it's also like not so much known as John Cage or Dick Higgins or other Fluxus members. He was a professor at the Rutgers University and taught there together with Alan Kaprow and Roy Lichtenstein. But also Robert Watts was a person who kind of connected Fluxus with pop art, because when we are now in the 1960s and 1961, this is also a moment when pop art started to flourish in the United States. And Robert Watts, when we think about his involvement in Fluxus, he was also very important for the pop artists. He's one of, here we can see, for example, a very early neon by him, made in 1965, which is showing the signature of the important old master Francisco Goya as a kind of supermarket or a shop neon, which was like very early in the 1960s. Here in 1964, Robert Watts, as a Fluxus member, he also participated in a very famous exhibition in the United States, which was called American Supermarket. American Supermarket was an exhibition which contained artworks by Jasper Johns, by Andy Warhol, by Billy Apple, Roy Lichtenstein, and of course Robert Watts. In this very exhibition, artists presented their works as they were showing goods in the supermarket. So they were selling, for example, paintings or sculptures as they were selling in a supermarket groceries. And the collectors took a place of a normal and ordinary person who is not buying art but buying a grocery. And for example, one could buy Andy Warhol for $18 or Roy Lichtenstein for $12. I'm sure now that like the prices are much more higher to buy than it was before. When we think about pop art and also the connections between previous movements, because like pop art was not only born like out of the blue. Robert Rauschenberg was a very important artist for pop art, and also when we remember the Black Mountain Review, and the Black Mountain Review, the magazine was edited by Robert Creeley, who actually was a very important poet for pop artists, and many pop artists like Robert Indiana, or for example here Tim Wesselman designed his pieces. But actually we are in at the beginning of 1960s. The New York scene started to really flourish with pop art and with art by Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Indiana, Jasper Johns, Jim Dine or Larry Rivers. They all belonged to the pop art movement. But it was also a very important moment for the social protest movements, which is, for example, exemplified when we think about here this poster, by the poster Love by Robert Indiana from May '66, because we need to remember that in the background of the artistic practice, it's always what is going on in the social life, and this very important poster, very known, is actually a protest song against the war in the Vietnam. So the social movements were very important in the 1960s, not only because of Vietnam War, but also, for example, with regard to African American issues. And because like in the Archive of the Avantgarde, we do not have so many artworks by African Americans, I found one design of a Black Panthers magazine made by African-American artist Emory Douglas, which actually has a very on-time slogan, People's Free Health Clinics Now. And this magazine was devoted to the Black Panthers party, a party which rebelled for the social rights for African Americans. And I wanted to show a kind of a link between Emory Douglas and Roy Lichtenstein, because Emory Douglas was very influenced by the style of Roy Lichtenstein. When we again think about African Americans and the war in Vietnam, I think it is important to look at this sculpture by Claes Oldenburg, which is, when we go, maybe when we start from here, from the en face, it is a piece which is called the Fire Plug Souvenir, and it shows a miniature of a fire plug. Or a hydrant. But when we think about the context of the Vietnam War, unfortunately I cannot do it because it's behind the glass, but if I would have a gloves and I would put it upside down, the sculptures, it will show a person without legs and without upper side of the body, which is melted like in the taken with the napalm, which was used in the Vietnam War. So also in this context, we can think about here the profile of this fire plug, which shows actually a reference to a sculpture called the Nike from Samothrace, the ancient Greek sculpture which shows the wings without head and the very famous ancient a symbol of a victory, which is actually not a victory. Also, when we think about this, the sculpture, which is kind of placed in the center of this exhibition, which refers to Vietnam, which refers to other pieces. Also, we can look at it from this side as a kind of a fragmented female body. And which might also function as a kind of a reference to women bodies, because in the 1960s, when this was from the 1968, in the 1960s it was very important feminist movement. I mean, I talked about Alison Knowles, who actually was not a feminist but was an important artist who referred to the issues of maternity. The artist who started to rebel against patriarchy and showing feminism as a sort of artistic importance was for sure Caroline Schneemann, who is placed here in her performance, the Homer and Muse, presented at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Next to her, I decided to place Charlotte Moorman, who I think Caroline Schneemann would not regard her as a feminist artist because she worked together with Nam June Paik, a male artist who designed her as a living sculpture, playing actually John Cage here. But she was also very important when we think about women art in the United States. Actually, this performance, which maybe we can look at it, and it is called Opera Sextronic with Nam June Paik. It also refers to the Vietnam War when we see her performing the John Cage and Nam June Paik on the violin with a gas mask. And actually after this performance, because Charlotte Moorman was playing naked, only dressed in the violin, she was put into a jail and sentenced by the police. This actually performance of Charlotte Moorman Opera Sextronic was presented in a very important place in New York, which was Filmmaker Cinematheque. Filmmaker Cinematheque was founded by Jonas Mekas, a Lithuanian immigrant, and was run, and one of the very important artists who was connected to Filmmaker Cinematheque was also George Maciunas, leader of Fluxus. So we also see here another important place for the Fluxus artists, and here is a project for Filmmaker Cinematheque created by George Maciunas, so Lithuanian immigrant artist for the Lithuanian immigrant artist who owned this very place. Filmmaker Cinematheque was not only a place of performances, for example, of Charlotte Moorman, but also place where Velvet Underground, the important music band, presented their music, and also new films, new structuralist films by Andy Warhol. Actually, Andy Warhol presented his Chelsea Girls premiere in this very institution, and also Paul Scharitz. We can again see another points of connections between pop art and Fluxus. It was not only Robert Watts, but also Filmmaker Cinematheque, which showed the Fluxus member Paul Scharitz and Andy Warhol, for example. This here section is devoted actually to Andy Warhol. The cow by Andy Warhol is already all over the internet because of the of our advertisements of our virtual tour, and I would like only to talk a little bit about this Brillo box, which is, I think, very interesting in this context, that it is actually not original. It's the only not original piece made by artists from this whole exhibition. It is a box which was recreated for the exhibition of Andy Warhol at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 1966. Pontus Hulten, who was the curator of this exhibition, asked Warhol to send his pieces, but it was of Brillo boxes, but they were too expensive. So they decided that they will produce those boxes in Stockholm by the approval of Andy Warhol. So here we can also see again a kind of reproduction of pop art, and that like boxes made by, for example, not by Andy Warhol but approved by him, can still be, with this gesture, his artwork, only approved by him, which is also a kind of a reference to Marcel Duchamp, who started to create his first ready-mades still in the 1910s. This section shows also pieces by Andy Warhol and his famous tomato soup, and of course some photographs taken by Hugo Mulas, who was a photographer of the New York scene in the 1960s, taken in the Factory, the famous artistic studio by Andy Warhol, where he met a lot of important artists, also those who are here at this exhibition, including Clary Rivers, including Claes Oldenburg, or including some Fluxus members, including also Ray Johnson, who was a very guest who was very often present at the Factory by Andy Warhol. We have here some fragments of the movies by Andy Warhol, which were presented as a living portraits. Andy Warhol used a camera to show the portraits of important guests coming to the Factory. And actually it was connected to a new phenomena called expanded cinema, which was about exploring the issues of cinema, which is not more about the fiction or fabular motifs, but about exploring the use of camera or what we can do with the movie. As I already mentioned, in Filmmaker Cinematheque, Andy Warhol debuted with his movies. So was also Paul Scharitz, who was a Fluxus member and also screened his movies in Filmmaker Cinematheque, but he, unlike Andy Warhol, he developed his works much more toward the structuralist cinema, which we can see in this piece called The Frozen Frame, which is composed of stripes of a film and shows a sort of abstract work. I wanted to reconnect this work somehow with the color-filled painting. I already mentioned about it, talking about Josef Albers in the other section, and here this is somehow juxtaposed with Walter Darby Bannard and Ad Reinhardt in this place. So when we think still about the 1960s, I found in our archive requisites. I mean from the movie house. This is a performance presented in New York by Claes Oldenburg in 1962, which was a happening. It was during the times when Alan Kaprow already created his happenings, and in one of the New York cinema theaters, some performers started to use those masks and also started to distort screening the movie of one in the cinema of one movie. And when we think about also the shape of the mask of this Mickey Mouse, it is also the shape of the cinematographer from the 1960s, and it's supposed to put on the shadows on various sides. Here I wanted to put one of the pieces by Robert Indiana called Hug, which is a little bit not easy to reach. It's also a kind of a reference to today's times, that hugs are not so much allowed. And also the Brillo book by Andy Warhol with deluxe edition, together with Painted Blue Bread by Man Ray, who was also important figure for American art merely before the war. But this piece is from the 1950s. Here we are still in the section kind of between structuralist cinema and pop art, and also between a sort of a new media experiments. I started our tour from the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s, showing chronologically how the American art evolved. Also here I wanted to create a kind of a triptych from 3 pieces by Chuck Close, Peter Campus and Bruce Nauman, which explores in a somehow new media way the portraits of some personalities. He is a Katie, he is the 9 Polaroids by Peter Campus, who was actually also represented by the same gallery as, for example, Roy Lichtenstein, whose posters we already saw, by Leo Castelli Gallery, which was very important gallery for a vibrant new artistic movements in the 1960s. So we are still in the 1960s with pop art, with new media artists, and also minimal art, which was before represented by this poster of Bruce Nauman. And actually Gideon Martin, who is the collector who donated his whole archive to Archiv der Avantgarden. He was one of the first collectors of minimal and conceptual art, especially American minimal art. Here, this is a section which shows Robert's Grosvenor project of Topanga sculpture. The minimal artist kind of rebelled against pop art, against the colorful artistic movement, which is very much connected to artistic life, and as well as Fluxus was. Minimal artists started to minimalize their artistic practice to a very minimal shapes and forms. Like, for example, here the Dan Flavin piece, as well as Richard Tuttle and Bill Bollinger, who was actually an artist of the so-called post-minimalist movement, which connected minimalist approaches with industrial, sometimes with industrial environment. What it is important for the Archive of der Avantgarden are very beautiful photographs from John Weber Gallery, which have been donated from Egidio Marcona, both from Egidio Marcona, from John Weber Gallery, and donated to Archiv der Avantgarden in Dresden. And it showed various photographs of, for example, Robert Smithson here, of artists connected to land art, minimal art, which was also a very important artistic phenomenon at that time in the New York scene. Here are some. Here's a slideshow which contained around 50 or 60 artworks. Here are some conceptual works by minimalists, by Carl André, Lewitt, and Lawrence Wiener on Cavara, which supposed to be placed in one conceptual anthology by a German artist, Barbara Schmidt-Heinz, and we are lucky to have them in the archive, because thanks to that we can actually reconstruct this conceptual anthology which never happened. So here also is an interview with Egidio Marcona about his idea of collecting minimal art, how he started to collect, and he talks a lot about his project Archiv der Avantgarden, which grew out from minimal art, but now contains more than 1 million objects, which is actually not minimal at all. We can go maybe further on to the last sections of the exhibition, because also Egidio Marcona was collecting land arts and inviting some of the American artists to his villa in Italy to create land art over there. He also bought a cassette, a video VHS cassette from Gary Schum, a very important gallerist from Germany, who started to film land artworks. Actually, land art can only be filmed or photographed, because you cannot show land arts which is in, for example, at the Salt Lake in Utah. You cannot exhibit it in museum. Only you can see it live or through the documentation of the photographs. And the sets of photographs are by Robert Smithson, a famous spiral jetty. Those photographs made by Gianfranco Gorgoni we also have in our archive. This what I wanted to show with this exhibition is that we started with a natural environment, the Lake Eden and Black Mountain in North Carolina, to show how it was very important place for experimentation. Then we moved to New York and looked at the very vibrant New York scene with Fluxus, with pop art, with minimal, and came came back actually to natural environment, because artists also started to somehow rebel against galleries, rebel against metropolises, and went to the natural environment, which is exemplified, for example, by the works of Robert Smithson, presented in this video from Gary Schum Gallery from Düsseldorf. This is somewhere in the Midwest in the United States, and the famous spiral jetty, which refers to the primal symbols of Native Americans, Indians. We have also in the archive a very important photograph by Karl André, who was also an important minimalist and then land art artist, because Robert Smithson, together with Karl André, they exhibited at the Dwan Gallery, which was guided then by John Weber in 1968 at the famous exhibition called Earthworks. And Earthworks, it's American term, and land art, it's European term, but it is the same meaning of art presented in the natural environment, or to put the natural environment inside the gallery. I found it interesting to put in this context this sculpture by Louis Nevelson, which is called the Nightscape Presence, which is also created from wood and refers to the natural landscape, and connected to at the end to the soundscape of John Cage, which is the last piece presented in this exhibition, and is called Mozart, Music Without Horizon, Soundscape That Never Stops. This actually device, we can say, there are like 5 devices which are played simultaneously. So the idea is to mix Mozart with a constant loop, never-ending music which is mixing with each other all the time. And we can, for example, regard John Cage as a kind of a prototype of today's DJing and the looping system and the idea of the constant loop. So when I started the tour, when we remember, I started also with an image of John Cage presented by Hazel Larson Archer. It's the very first image over there when he was, I don't remember, around 40 years old or something like that. And the exhibition ends with image of John Cage from the end of the 1970s. I also wanted to show that not only art changed during the course of 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, but also people changed. They also visually changed, their artworks changed, and the whole idea of this exhibition was to create transformative processes of American art from the 1940s, 1950s, 60s until 1970s to show how avant-garde art produced by them was so important for developments of the post-war arts in general. Actually, this was my idea of creating a kind of a visual essay based on the documents and artworks from one particular collection, which was Archiv der Avantgarden. We have also produced a catalog which is edited by me, with a text, my text explaining the visual essay, which was this exhibition, and the points of interconnections between Black Mountain College, Fluxus, pop art, minimal art, land art, and other artistic practices. And there is also a text by Filip Lipiński, who looks more, who is also a Fulbrighter like me. He also was awarded a Fulbright to United States. He writes more about interconnections between singular pieces, not like me when I write about connections between galleries or artists or artistic movements. He's focused on relationships. His text is focused on the relationships between actual objects and texts. And if you would like to read his text and also interview with Gideon Martin about his idea of collecting, I think it is worth to look at it and and read this catalog. So I think I couldn't talk about all of the artworks because I think we will spend here much more time than expected. But I don't know how it works with live streaming. If it is possible for people to ask questions, I will be happy to answer them. Are there? No? Okay, so.